Meanwhile, protesters have taken to the streets in the U.S. capital of Washington, D.C. to denounce police brutality.
What do we want? Justice! What do we want it? What do we want? Justice! What do we want it? What do
Rally coincided with the U.S. Independence Day. Demonstrators condemned the police killing of unarmed African American George Floyd and demanded an end to racism. They also called for major reforms in the law enforcement system. To discuss those two stories a little bit further, I'm going to bring in Mr. Max Parry. He's an independent researcher who comes to you live via Skype out of New York. Max, it's good to have you with us. Please tell us your take on what the U.S. president has said recently regarding the recent developments and, of course, the radical left and destroying it or defeating it altogether.
Well, in my view, this is actually a smart strategy on his part to position himself in this way, because it's the perfect distraction from, his totally incompetent mishandling of the pandemic that seemingly everybody recognizes. And so, for him to position himself now as this so-called defender of American history and culture, he's taking advantage of the attacks on these monuments to leaders of the American Revolution and the Civil War. It's being spearheaded by the promoters of racialist politics in the Democratic Party. And, it's also a smart move for him to position himself in the same manner as, the so-called law and order candidate, which Republicans have been doing since Richard Nixon adopted the Southern strategy to win the presidency in 1968. I think he's been able to do this precisely because, in many respects, these demonstrations, which began as protests against police brutality and racism, have, even according to many people who support them, have many people believe that they've sort of veered off track, into a public referendum on statues and monuments without bringing any actual substantial change in policy-wise to the militarization of police in the immediate future. And, as far as these the statues and monuments go, it began as, I think everybody recognizes that these taking down these Reconstruction era Confederate statues is something that's long overdue. But it's, gone way beyond that point now to where it's including, the Lincoln Memorial and, a statue of Ulysses S. Grant, who was the leader of the Union Army in the Civil War, was toppled in San Francisco. And it's even included, Union officers that were abolitionists. So I think many people who are even supportive of the protests in general have felt like it started to veer off track and go too far. And I think, Trump is taking advantage of this, and it's the perfect distraction from his mishandling of the coronavirus.
And perhaps, I was thinking, Max, that this is also a distraction from the main issue here. We're talking, those statues, they were there, just like the issue of racial profiling that has always been there. And, it's only recently that they're being taken down. Maybe, I'm only thinking, you tell me what you think. Maybe it's also a distraction from the main demand by saying that I'm going to root them out. Maybe it's just, giving a false address of from the main demand of the people, that is, once and for all, bring these police officers and the justice system to a just system, really, and at the same time address the will of the nation.
I couldn't agree more. And, you know, I think ultimately these sort of iconoclastic, symbolic gestures of taking down statues is ultimately not really getting to the heart of the matter. And it's it's not really a threat. I mean, a perfect example is the American Museum of Natural History here in New York City. There's a controversial statue right outside of it of Teddy Roosevelt being flanked by a Native American and an African slave. And there were actually not any calls to remove it, and the museum voluntarily, voluntarily offered to remove it. So how much of a threat really is these sort of symbolic moves? And, you know, it's the perfect way to avoid, producing any sort of substantial legislation, demilitarizing the police, which, since the 1033 program and the 1994 crime bill were enacted have, become so militarized. There's SWAT teams even in small towns now. This is the perfect distraction. And I think a lot of people feel like these protests have been corralled and reeled in from their original purpose. And I happen to agree with that take. I think that this is a deviation from what they originally started as.
Thank you very much. That's Mr. Max Parry, independent researcher who spoke to us via Skype out of New York. I really appreciate your time, Max.